To begin, I'm going to show you how to thread a needle, and I actually call this needling the thread, which sounds a bit strange, but you'll see what I mean. To measure your thread, there's a few little differences depending on what you're sewing, what thread you're using, your own experience. But basically go from the tip of your finger and measure up to your elbow. I actually go a little bit longer myself. I go almost, not as far as my shoulder, but a little bit longer. If you're doing regular straight stitch, which is what I'm going to show you today, you can go a bit longer. If you're doing other stitches, which I'll show you another time, such as a lot of seed stitch or French knots or similar, you'll want a shorter thread. If your thread is quite fine, so this one here, I'm not sure if you can see the difference. I'll put it on a piece of white fabric. If you can see the difference between the reds and the blue thread. So the red thread is much finer than the blue thread. That means it's prone to tangling a little bit more. So I would go a little bit shorter. The reason that you don't want your thread too long is because the more the thread pulls through the fabric, the longer you do that, it creates friction. So the thread actually loses its quality. But you don't want it too short because you don't want to be changing your, rethreading your needle and changing your thread too often. So find what works for you and experiment. But if you're new to this, start a little bit shorter than longer. Now this is needling the thread. Most people, so I'm going to try and hope that the camera is going to focus on, change focus. Most people, to start with, here's a needle. The needles are actually made in a certain way, and you might not know this, but you might. I find a lot of people at my workshops go, wow. You'll find that sometimes when you're threading the needle, it's a little bit difficult. If you turn it around, it makes it a bit easier. Sort of hard to see in the camera and even in real life, but you might notice from one side, it's like it's however it's sharpened goes through and to the other side. So it's like naturally the thread wants to go one way. If you're trying to put it the other way, there's a little bit of resistance. You're trying to go like against the grain. So imagine if something's poked through and it's pushing the bits of metal to the other side. It's still all smoothed off, but that's something to consider. If it's hard at first, then turn the needle around, go through a different eye. Now, a lot of people, when they start to thread their needle, they hold their needle and they try, and especially with smaller ones, so obviously with a bigger needle it's definitely a bit easier, but they try and wave around this long bit of thread and get it in. That's pretty difficult. This is why I call it needling the thread. So here we have just the tiniest bit of thread. Make it as short as possible on your fingers, between your fingers, and pinch it tight. And then it's much easier. Mine's got a little bit ragged. I'm going to cut it clean. It's then much easier to put the needle. Of course, while I'm showing you this, it's not going to work easily because that's what always happens as soon as I put a video on. To put the needle straight, theoretically, you'll find. Oh, I just waited a tiny bit. To put the needle straight through the thread. So if you hold your thread closer and shorter, if you need to cut it tight, if you need to put a tiny bit of water, that is easier than that piece of long thread. So that's the first thing to remember, is to needle your thread rather than threading your needle. And for those really new to stitching, I know there are a few of you who are, we're not going to pull this together and tie a knot with the ends. We're just going to keep one tail and the other tail longer. So here is now how to tie a quilter's knot. This is not necessary, particularly for stitching, but it's actually very, very handy. I might just put a bigger bit of white fabric at the back to hope that you can see a bit better. The shadows have just come in, which is what always happens as soon as I'm child free and able to video. So this is a really very handy to know, because while it's called a quilter's knot, it actually comes into play a lot, and I will be working with it and hoping that you know it. If you get it wrong, don't worry. Try and try and try. If you really don't understand it, then it's completely okay. So to begin, we've got our thread, we've got our tail. For all of this, I am right-handed, so I'm working with my right hand. If any of you specifically want left-handed instructions, let me know and I'll swap over. So holding over the eye, we get the tail of our thread, and holding your needle, the sharp of the needle is here, the eye is down here. We wrap the tail of our thread, so they both point like this to face it. To the needle point is going up, the thread tail is going down. And we wrap the point of the needle around, 3 wraps around. So this is the tail of the thread, this is the sharp of the needle. I'm not sure if the camera's focusing on the right spot here. It happens to do that, unfortunately. Now I'm holding these 3 little wraps on the shaft of the needle, and I'm pulling it down. I'm going to then swap hands and hold the shaft of the needle. When I get past this eye, I'm holding this eye with my right hand so that it doesn't fall off, and glide the left hand, the needle, the thumb and forefinger, all the way down. Gently pull it. You'll see there's this little loop, and all the way down. And what you have here is a quilter's knot. So it's a knot that's sometimes a little bit bigger, but it has this nice tail. And this is what we actually want to utilize here. It's a strong, firm knot, so when you are doing quilting, it won't come undone as easily. So I'm going to show you that one more time. So tip, pointy bit, eye, tail of the thread, and oh, the sun's just changed, nice. And you wrap the point of the needle into the tail. So 1, 2, 3 wraps. Hold this and glide this. So this is the tail of your thread. Glide it all the way down. If you get any tangles in here, just untwist them before you keep gliding. The nice thing about this is, if you did this wrong, it will generally not create your knot. So it'll just untangle to a straight thread. Keep practicing. I do have a little illustration, so if you want me to, let me know and I'll put that up for you as well. So this is a practical one to learn, and while I won't expect you to know it going forward, it would be really handy if you could. What I'm now going to show you is how to utilize this in our quilting by in all our stitching, by starting a new row of thread, finishing a row, and also changing colors halfway through a row, or running out of thread halfway through a row. So I might do these two together to give myself a bit more. going to pin them together. I've just got 2 pieces of fabric. They are joined. So obviously mine's linen, so there's no right or wrong side. But if yours was other fabric, you at this stage would have your 2 wrong sides. So the not good side of fabric, it's called wrong side. 2 wrong sides facing each other. And so what you see on this side and what you see on that side is the good side of your fabric. So to start with, this is where this lovely knot comes into play. I'm going to go from the top and I'm going to feel for myself, just go into the top layer of fabric. I'm not going to go through the whole layer, so I won't see it on the other side. So I'm going to feel when I poke the needle through, that's just going to go through 1 layer of fabric. So you can actually start to get a feel for this when you stitch. You can feel it, and then you can look over and see there is no needle there. So then I want you to come up. The shadows are getting too shadowy. I'm going to turn it off a bit and put a sheet up.